All right. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to see you all, and there's more people filtering in. So I'm going to start us off as we usually do with land acknowledgement. And you're welcome to put in the chat, as was said, where you're zooming in from as well. But we at Open Democracy are zooming in from Indakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. So we're just honoring and acknowledging this and honoring the land and waterways that we are working on and zooming in from. And we thank the Anunnaki, the people who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations and continue to do so today. And we are gathered here for Who Stole the American Dream? So I'm going to hand it off to Kate.
Okay, so our book group, which has really developed a solid foundation and a vision for the future, has these three questions that we go by every single time. Where are we? How do we get here? What do we do about it? And as the one of the blurbs on the back of Hedrick's book says, some fine work has been done in explaining the mess we're in, but no book goes to the headwaters with the precision, detail, and accessibility of Smith. And then it also says, Smith posits some steps that could alleviate the problems of the United States. No small task, but we think he's up to it. Olivia?
We welcome Hedrick to our Open Democracy Book Club. Hedrick has been with Open Democracy before, walking with us, doing talks in New Hampshire. Hedrick is a New York Times journalist, an author, a documentarian, a PBS award-winning. I can't even tell you everything Hedrick's done because it's just such a long, amazing list. And I'd rather you just hear from the amazing, talented Hedrick Smith. And we'll ask Hedrick to unmute.
Okay, you got me? All right, great. I have to thank you all for inviting me. I always feel great connecting with Open Democracy in New Hampshire. I love you all. I love you individually, and I love what you're trying to do. So any way I can help is a pleasure and an honor for me. Olivia, of course, whenever she asks you something, prompts you to do something. So I decided that I better kind of update some of the numbers from my book. And I've done a bunch of research. And by the way, it's going to be in the next book I write, the updated numbers and some new material. But let me share with you some really stunning facts about America today. We're two Americas, we know that. We've got inequality, we know that. Three men, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Bill Gates, have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country. That's 165 million people. The top 1% have total wealth greater than the bottom 90%. The top 1%. So about 1.2 million people, or families, 1.2 million families. The typical CEO of a Standard & Poor 500 company makes 399 times the pay of the average worker. Now that's just a number. But if you actually want to put it into life, that means on January 2nd, the first day of work, at about 3:45 in the afternoon, the CEO of that Standard & Poor 500 company has made as much money as the average worker is going to make all year. January 2nd, 3:45 in the afternoon. Under COVID, millions of Americans were going broke, struggling to put food on the table, pay the rent, deal with all kinds of basic economic hardships. And the 738 billionaires in America made $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion, 738 billionaires. Inequality is not just a matter of numbers, of course. It's a matter of anxiety versus security, fear versus confidence, the kind of life you can lead, not just the amount of money that's in your bank account. The real problem that has happened for the middle class is what I call the delinking of the standard of living of the middle class wages from the productivity of the nation. Productivity is what generates wealth. The more efficient our machines are, the more efficient our workers are, the more efficient our technology is, the greater the output, the greater value there is for all of us. And if you split it up as a big pie, the greater share each one of us should have. The old idea was a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that's not true. That is not true in the same way now as it has been in our past history. And the reason is that since 1979, before 1979, I'm going to tell you about in a moment, but since 1979, productivity has gone up 64%, but the median worker's pay has gone up only 17%. Now, that's a huge difference, and it actually means about $20,000 a year in people's income. So there's a practical impact of that. Or you can look at the floor, the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage today is $7.25. It hasn't gone up in the last 14 years. If the minimum wage had risen along with rising productivity, that's the money that the whole economy can generate, the minimum wage today would be $19 an hour. Not asking for any more from the people at the bottom, not asking for any more for the people in the middle. They're just steadily falling behind, not just behind the 1%, not just behind the 10%, but behind the average productivity of the nation as a whole. That's what I call wedge economics. Wedge economics because there's a wedge that has been driven between the growth and the productivity of the national economy and the living standards of people in the middle, and of course, the people at the top. Now, I think most of us probably became aware of wedge economics and thinking about economic inequality from our own lives, from our own communities. But as a nation, it was probably Occupy Wall Street, the protests in New York that started against the accumulation of wealth by the 1%, by the corporations back in 2011. And I remember thinking at that time, wow, the 1% versus the 99%, that's a really clever kind of bumper slogan. It's a nice slogan, but it probably isn't true. Literally, the 99% and the 1%. Well, it is true. I found that out later. There was an economist named Alan Kruger from Princeton who eventually became the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Barack Obama. And he did a lot of research. And what he found out was that from 1979 until 2011, which is the last bit of research I did before this book was written, and the numbers are probably a little bit worse today than they were then, that during that period, the top 1% got 84% of the increase in the entire nation's income. The whole nation's income went up, 84% of it went to the top 1%. That means the rest of us, the other 99%, got 16%. And it was the top 1% got 5 times as much of the nation's growth in income as the entire rest of the country. In other words, Occupy Wall Street was right on target. It's right on target. Now, I'm going to say to you, because you asked, how do we get here and what do we do about it? It wasn't always this way. It doesn't have to be this way. It was different before. If you go back to the period before 1979, which is really kind of the dividing line economically for modern America. If you go back to the period from 45 to 79 or 80, that's 35 years. There was remarkable sharing of prosperity in this country. Economists like to split us up into 20%, top 20%, middle 20%, bottom 20%, so forth. In that period, from post-war period, 1945 to about 1980, all 5 groups moved up economically just about the same percentage. In fact, the lower 4 moved up a little bit better than the top 20%. I told you before about the connection between productivity and median wages. It's amazing. The productivity in that period went up 110%, and the median wage went up 107%. In other words, almost 100% on target. Wealth was being shared across the country. Growth was being shared. Doesn't mean everybody was equal. The average CEO, Charlie Wilson at General Motors, people at the Exxon Mobil and so forth, they were making 30 times what the average worker was making. 30 times. Now it's almost 400 times. Notice the difference? So the differences were there. CEO is going to make more than an average worker, of course. And somebody who's been working for 15 or 20 years is going to make more than somebody who's just come in. But the difference between the top and the bottom was a reasonable range. And the question then is, how do we achieve this? And if we wanted to do it again, what would we do about it? Two things are important about economics. Two things are important in figuring out and determining how the economics of our country, and probably all other countries as well, work. One is power, and the other is ideas. The idea that was important during that whole post-war period was what was called stakeholder capitalism. The recognition by the CEOs, the bosses of the biggest companies, was that everybody who worked in that company had a stake in it. The customers had a stake. They wanted the product to be there. They wanted the cars or the cell phones or whatever to be there and to be serviced and have replacement parts and modern updated models and that kind of stuff. The people in the communities where the factories were, where the insurance companies were, where the offices were, they had a stake in the success of those companies. Certainly the workers did, certainly the owners did, certainly the managers did. But the notion that everybody had a stake in the success of that company was frequently stated by the CEOs of General Electric, General Motors, you name it, Standard Oil of New Jersey, all across the board. It's very important, that whole idea, because they had this notion that if you paid the workers well, this is Henry Ford, 1918, $5 day. He started a $5 day. First time it had happened in American history. It was enormous, huge pay raise for people. Henry Ford said, if I pay a $5 a day, they can afford to buy the Model Ts that Ford Motor is making. That's the basic idea. The idea is, and it's very important to understand this, because you're going to have people talk to you about the job creators and the necessity to protect the job creator. The job creators in America are you and me. It is the consumers. Consumption is 70% of what is the engine, 70% of the engine that drives the American economy. If you pay millions of people well, and they go spend, and Americans spend their money. We don't save a lot in America. Japanese, some other countries say save more than we do. We spend our money, but that helps drive the economy, drives growth. They called it the virtuous circle of the economy. High pay, high spending, high growth, high productivity, high demand, high pay, and the circle goes on, feeding itself. That's the whole idea. That's that connection between the pay for the middle class workers and the productivity growth. Those were linked. Very important that they were linked. And it was very important. There's a guy from the University of Massachusetts named Bill Lazonick, an economist, a very smart guy. He did a study to compare 2013, 2012 with 1975. And it's very interesting. In 1975, he asked, what are the profits of major American corporations being used for? He took the Standard & Poor 500 major corporations in this country. And what he found out was they spent 53% of their profits on average every year and paid it back to the owners, the investors, the stock market, the people who had invested in the company. And 47% they plowed back into the company, spending a lot of it on improving worker training, equipment, innovating new products and so forth. They spent it on the company and the workers benefited from that. Very important. Again, the people at the top were saying, we believe in investing in ourselves. I'm going to tell you those numbers today, and they're shockingly different. The second thing was there was enormous power in ordinary Americans in this long period from 1945 to 1975. I mean, we had, think of it, there was the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which is a movement that came from below. There was the women's movement, Betty Friedan and all those people. This is long before, Me Too, and the modern women's movement. But the women's movement got started, and the environment movement was strong then. The labor movement was much stronger back in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And what you had was people speaking out. You had Washington listening, and you had a lot of pressure to keep taxes reasonably high. Taxes, believe it or not, the individual income tax under Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s was 92%. And now we think it's very high if it's 40%. Corporate tax now is 21%. The corporate tax used to be 52%, so forth. So the taxes on high earning individuals and high corporations were very different. And one of the reasons was there was so much active citizen power at the bottom. Okay, power from the bottom against the top. Now we're in this new era of wedge economics, which developed really starting around 1980. What happened? What happened was a change in ideas and a change in power, a shift in power, which was triggered, interestingly enough, by a guy who went on the Supreme Court, a guy named Lewis Powell. He was a corporate lawyer. He was close to a lot of people in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and they were getting concerned that they thought labor had too much power. What should we do about it? And Powell wrote this memo in 1971, just before Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And basically he said, business, you've got to get into the political game. You've got to come to Washington. You've got to lobby Congress. You've got to push for a legislation that will help corporations. And you need to exercise your political muscle because you're being taken advantage of. At the time Lewis Powell wrote his memo, only 175 companies in America had lobbying offices in Washington. By the end of that decade, by 1980, there were 2,425 companies that had offices in Washington. There were 50,000 people working for trade associations, and the landscape of power changed in Washington. Most people think of the change in policy coming under Ronald Reagan, Republican, pro-business, cut taxes, that kind of stuff. Actually, the change began under Jimmy Carter in 1978. The first big tax cut occurred in 1978, a cut in the capital gains tax from 48% to 28%. That's a tax that's on investment gains. It's not on work. So we're reducing taxes on investment gains there. They changed the bankruptcy laws to make it much more beneficial for corporate leadership, and all kinds of damage was done to the trade unions as corporations declared bankruptcy in the 90s and the 2000s. Corporations began ripping up the pension plans they had with their employees. Employees took all kinds of losses, billions of dollars of losses. It began to change. And then what you begin to see is the exercise of power. You now look at political campaigns. We spend $9 billion on the midterm elections. We spend $14–15 billion on presidential elections. Corporations are outspending labor 16-1 on declared, and dark money we don't know, but we assume it's probably a heck of a lot more. We can't track the dark money. If you look at the lobbying, when I checked on the lobbying, in terms of the lobbying in Washington and people putting pressure on Congress to adopt legislation friendly to them, business had 12,785 lobbyists. Remember, there are only 535 members of Congress, 100 senators, 435 in the House. Think of that. They had 30 or so lobbyists for every single member of Congress. Labor had 403. 12,785. Guess who has the leverage? So you begin to see, as a result of this shift in power, an erosion of the standard of living that we were talking about in that earlier period from 1945 to 1973. And then by the time you get Reagan in power, you start to see the money interests capture government. The tax cut enacted under Reagan have delivered in the last 3 or 4 decades $3 trillion of wealth to the top 1%. The tax cuts then added under George W. Bush added another trillion, and the tax cuts under Donald Trump, added another trillion. So talking about tax cuts pushed by pro-business, pro-wealthy people, adding $5 trillion in wealth to the top 1%. Okay. So this didn't just happen because of economics, it happened because of politics. But something else happened. The idea changed. We went from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism. That sounds good, right? Shareholders? Well, the basic idea was invented by some guys at Harvard Business School and Chicago School of Economics. Milton Friedman, a very conservative economist, came up with the idea you should really pay CEOs as if they were shareholders and reward them with shares of stock, not just with salaries. And that began, and it began to shift and break this link between the middle class and the productivity. And it began to balloon the incomes of the top 1%, and certainly the corporate CEOs. As I told you before, the productivity went up 64% since 1979, and the median wage only went up 17%. You began to get an attitude within corporate America of the winner take all. People at the top decided they could just take more. And now you have Charlie Wilson, who was the highest paid CEO in the 1950s, the CEO in charge of General Motors. He got paid about $600,000 a year. If you readjust that for inflation, that would work out to about $5 or $6 million now. $5 or $6 million? The top paid CEO last year made $895 million. There were a whole bunch that made $200, $300, $400 million. The ratio of pay I mentioned to you before was 30 to 1. In the old days, Charlie Wilson made 30 times as much as the average assembly line. I looked up the figures that I could get, the most recent ones that I could get, and the number was I'm looking for it here because I want to give it to you exactly. It's 6,474. And there are several people. Andy Jassy, that's at Amazon. Andy Jassy at Amazon makes 6,474 times what the average Amazon worker makes. 6,000. Before it used to be 30 to 1. There were several over 2,000. I mean, it's amazing. I mentioned to you before the buybacks of corporate stocks and what corporations did with their profits. This guy, Lazonic, I told you before that back in the day where prosperity was being shared, they spent about 53% on the owners and 47% reinvested in the business, which meant helping the workers and so forth. Lazonic then studied it in 2012, and he found that that corporations had now shifted. They were now returning 91% of their profits, 91%. To their owners, to the shareholders, to Wall Street. And they were spending only 9% on developing their own business. It's not just on workers, but it's on new products, on new markets, on all kinds of efficiencies and growth. In other words, the ball game had shifted enormously. Now, there are a whole bunch of things that I can tell you that hurt the average workers and the average middle-class citizens and contributed to inequality. I don't have time to go into them all. You can go into them in the book. But just a couple. Everybody thinks of retirement today as 401k. 401k is a defined contribution plan. It's a plan which we fund ourselves by contributing to a retirement plan with our employees. Before this period, up until actually the 401k plan was adopted under Carter in 1978, in that famous legislative session of 1978. But it was designed actually as a deferred compensation tax shelter for executives. It was only a few years later that everybody got included. And then the mutual fund said, oh my God, we can get everybody to invest enough instead of having a corporate plan. The corporate pension plan, the old system, used to send a monthly paycheck to everybody who worked for the company from the day they retired until the month they retired. I'm sorry, till the month they died, from the day they retired until they died. Corporations funded 89% of the cost of retirement. Under the 401k plan, they fund 49% of the cost of retirement. Under the old plan, employees funded 11% of the cost. Under 401ks, employees fund 51% of the cost. That is a shift of hundreds of billions of dollars a year from the books of the corporation onto your and my wallet, pocketbook, and checking account, okay? It's a huge change. So again, part of corporate America delinking the pay and benefits for average workers from the growth in productivity. The people at the top just have been taking another share, more and more share. There's another huge change that occurred. and that hurt the middle class greatly. And that was in the field of housing. You may recall at the end of the 1990s, we were having a housing boom. Money was easy. They were doing all kinds of very inexpensive loans. They used to have a requirement that you had to put 20% down to buy a house. They finally got 100% loans. They got the loans they called no-doc loans, where you didn't have to prove actually that you really had the money to be able to pay it. But worst of all, there were the ARM loans. ARM, not your arm, but the adjustable rate mortgage. What that meant was they sold you a house with a mortgage that began for 2 years with a very low rate. You didn't pay back any of the principal, you only paid the interest. But in 2 years or 3 years, whatever the ARM was, the adjustable rate, it shot up. And what happened was, and this is part of what caused the financial collapse of 2008, suddenly after 2 years, people couldn't afford to pay for the mortgage that they had on their house. And so the bank went and took the house back. That happened all over the country. The collapse of the banking system in 2008 changed from a subprime crisis into a regular prime crisis for everybody. $6 trillion worth of home values that had been owned by the homeowners shifted to the banks because so many millions of people lost out, couldn't afford, lost their jobs or kept their jobs, or maybe they had part-time jobs, but they couldn't afford to pay their mortgages, or they hadn't understood their mortgages well. They've been pretty much hoodwinked. There's an awful lot of cheating going on mortgages at that point. And there was a lot of foolishness on the part of customers too. But now think of that. I've told you that the wages were not growing along with productivity. I've told you that the retirement account costs hundreds of billions of dollars a year. I've told you that we went from a point where homeowners own 65% of the value, the $20 trillion value of housing all over America, and it fell down to 30%. $6 trillion got lost that way. And there are many, many other ways in which the middle class has been suffering. And I told you also, the minimum wage is stuck at $7.25. And if it had just gone up with productivity, it should be $19 an hour. So you're going to have discussion groups and you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do about this. Let me just share with you a couple of things. One is obviously raise the minimum wage, right? I mean, and what's good is 29 states have raised the minimum wage. The minimum wage in California and New York now is $15 an hour. And I'm embarrassed to say I didn't look up to see what the minimum wage is in New Hampshire. I hope
$7.25.
What?
For $7.25.
Oh, that's terrible. It's just terrible. So if you go into your working groups, that one of the things you need to do right away is do something about it. 29 states have taken the initiative, including South Dakota, Alaska, Arkansas. Lots of conservative states have raised the minimum wage above the federal minimum wage. And that's the first thing you do. Second thing was we got 55 corporations who made billions of dollars last 2 years ago. This latest date I've got the tax numbers on. And 55 of them paid zero taxes. Zero taxes, because there are all kinds of loopholes and deductions. What Biden did in the Inflation Reduction Act was to put in a required minimum tax for corporations. I don't have time here to explain to you how complicated the tax system is for corporations, but imposing a minimum tax for corporations will begin to start to correct for some of the inequalities we've got. You know, the other thing is you can start to roll back some of those tax cuts that were given the 1% and the high earners by Reagan and Bush and Trump. And then start to investing in worker training. I mean, all kinds of technological skills are needed now. Jobs are changing. So there's another whole arena you can look at. And then the infrastructure and R&D. I mean, one thing that I don't know what you think about President Biden, but I'm talking about him strictly as a news analyst. He has begun to tackle some of the issues we're talking about. Not always trying to address inequality, but when he's talking about building roads and highways and improving the ports and the airports in this country, improving the electronic infrastructure on the internet, so for all of those will generate jobs that are good paying jobs, which will require, in some instances, retraining. So there are a whole lot of areas But you can also try to put heat on corporations, say, hey, this is nuts. You're giving 91% of your earnings back to your profits back to Wall Street, to rich people who already got more money than they know what to do with. Elon Musk, he needs more money. I mean, come on. Jeff Bezos, he needs more money. No, how about taking more of your money and just plowing more of it back into your business? Because as they invest in their business, it will begin to lift the people at the bottom. There's so much more to talk about. I'm going to stop. I know you need to go do another part of your...
No, but I'd like to have you answer a couple of questions that are coming in from the chat. So
Okay.
Peter Powell says the middle class needs to get organized, and it will, but we have to get money out of politics and the electoral system first. This will take a constitutional amendment, but it will be a lot of work. Thoughts?
Well, there's no question something's got to be done about money in politics. And we're up to, what are we up to, 20 states? It's tough to get to 36 states. I have to say I've been impressed with 2 or 3 other things that, other than just getting money out of politics. You all should take a look at the state of Connecticut. It has public funding of campaigns, and it is enormously successful. It has changed the legislature in Connecticut in terms of who's in it and what policies they do. And they've gotten both parties. They've gotten it now so well embedded that people in both parties are using it. I think 85% of the people running, 85% of the people running opposed all took public funding in the last 2 or 3 cycles of elections in Connecticut. It reduces the power of, particularly of state contractors, big businesses within the state. It has a terrific effect on the politics, and they have put on it the condition: if you take public funding, then you must agree not to take any of the big money. You can't take any private money if you take public money. So what they've done is they've gotten money out of politics without passing a law. They've gotten big money out of politics. They haven't taken money out of politics because you need some money to run the campaigns. But they've gotten they've got the cost of a campaign down to 1/3 or 1/5 of what it was before, and they've gotten the big money out of politics. That's the first thing. And then in California, what they've really done is they've basically said that everybody has to declare the money that they're putting into politics. And at the moment, in most states, nonprofits, and there, I mean, most of the people who are running dark money operations in American politics today are nonprofits, and they have exemptions under most state laws that nonprofits don't have to report their funding. What California did said, we don't care whether you're a nonprofit or a profit. If you spend $50,000 in the California political campaign, you must disclose your funder and you must disclose the Matryoshka dolls. You know what I mean? Matryoshka dolls are, you can't say people for Blue Skies gave money to people for Happy Dogs, gave money to people for Good Children who gave money to my campaign, and therefore my donor was the people for Good Children. No. It's Henry Jones and Jane Ketchum that gave the money in the first place. You got to get to. So California has very strict disclosure laws, tougher disclosure laws, and that has a very good effect, because when people can see who's giving the money, then they really know who the candidate stands for. So don't give up those options. Those options have been passed. They passed muster with the Supreme Court, and you don't have to get a constitutional amendment, and they make a big difference.
Okay. Rana asked, Mr. Smith, in addition to campaign finance reform, addressing gerrymandering is one of the real problems of a perpetual war on our economy. Where do we start?
You start at home. Start right there in your own state. I mean, there's no question. You are absolutely right. I happen to believe that the most important problem to fix in our political system, because money's so tough, is the parties. You got to stop party primaries. The best thing to do is have nonpartisan primaries. I mean, Alaska this year just adopted nonpartisan primaries, and the results of the elections in Alaska were amazing. For the first time in Alaska in about 50 years, they elected a Democrat to Congress. And the only reason they did it was they had a nonpartisan primary with ranked choice voting. What you had was a couple of Republicans were running well, and then as soon as it got down to the last two, some of the people who voted for one of the Republican candidates had the Democrat down as their second or third choice. So, and you've got that up in Maine. Gerrymandering is absolutely critical. I mean, and now you've got the Supreme Court saying basically they're not going to do anything about it. So it's up to fixing it in your local legislature and then making sure that your own Supreme Court supports gerrymander reform. You can't do anything about gerrymandering in other states. You can only do about it. You can only do something about it in your own state. But fortunately, you know, there are more and more states that have dealt with gerrymander reform. And now we're up against a really difficult situation because there's a fight in North Carolina between the North Carolina Republican-dominated legislature and a decision by the Democrat majority in the Supreme Court, which threw out the Republican gerrymander. And the Republicans have gone to the Supreme Court and said, look, this is against the US Constitution. The US Constitution says, Article 2, that determining the method and manner of elections is up to the state legislature. And the question is, will the Supreme Court say, yeah, the literal words are what they are, or will they say, no, we have a system in which all laws are reviewed by the courts, including us. So we're up against a really tough problem there. But basically, gerrymandering, you got to solve at home.
I'm just going to invite anyone if they want to raise their hand to ask a question of Hedrick. And I see lots of other questions in the chat, so I can move to some of, and maybe I can just ask Lois, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Am I okay? Yeah. I'm gonna just read it. Is that all right?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. Well, it seems to me there was a real moral core to the Great Compression era, and that the Powell memo scrapped pretty bluntly. And I wonder if we can really return to a just and democratic society without restoring a moral core that we live and that we hold to and that we work from in doing this work. Reverend Barber, I'm sure many of you know this, he's established with Yale Divinity School a center where the work is going to be exactly that. And I think it's a great model. And now we have a reference point that we can refer to when we come from that place. But do you think this can happen without a restoration of what clearly is not part of the current capitalist philosophy of today? Can we really?
Well, I think that ethics are certainly critical to the way our society operates, critical to the way any society operates, and some kind of restoration of ethics is necessary. But it's in the present political climate, it is something that will sell well with quite a lot of people and the kind of people who are on this Zoom call, and it will get nowhere with some other people that need to be persuaded. I have to say that the word fairness is a word with a lot of power to a lot of Americans. If you start talking to Americans about saying that we ought to have an economic system of equality, people are going to object and say, no, people are different and that kind of stuff. Well, but we ought to have something that's fair. Now, if it was fair for Charlie Wilson to make 30 times as much as his average worker on the assembly line, then it's pretty unfair for this guy at Amazon to be making 6,000 times what his average worker is making. And I think that's a case, that is actually an ethical argument, but you're not using the word ethics. You're talking about fairness. And it seems to me that that's the reason I talk in these terms and I try to use these numbers, because some of these numbers are so egregious that you ought to be able to get 80% of people to say that's not right. You know what I mean? And even some of the people who are really rich understand that 1% owning as much as the bottom 90% really isn't right. You know what I mean? So I think that's one reason why I stress the lopsided figures. It defends people's sense of fairness, and that is ethics. So I agree with you. The question to me is one of tactics. How do you go about it? What is going to be persuasive to whatever audience you're trying to talk to, whether it's your audience in Derry, or Concord, or Exeter, New Hampshire, or whether it's to the state of New Hampshire as a whole, or whether it's to the country as a whole. It seems to me you've got to be able to make a persuasive case that's a slam dunk. And I think the numbers are just devastating. They're just awful. They're obscene.
Well, the number that struck me in your book that just struck me, dumbstruck actually, was the 160 something to 1 as far as the power of the money and influence that labor went up against.
Oh, it's, yeah. I mean,
That is the kind of number I do think that is important for people to know, but it can't be something that leaves us feeling hopeless either, you know?
No, that's right. And that's one reason why I said when I was talking about politics, I mean, the state of Alaska adopted a nonpartisan primary in the 2022 election. Washington State has had nonpartisan primaries since 2008. California's had them since about 2014. Do you know there was an effort to push for a nonpartisan primary in North Dakota, Florida, and Arkansas in 2022, and it was only administrative tricks by the hardcore right-wing secretaries of state that kept that off the ballot. So if you got states like that, where there's enough savvy, enough energy, and people saying, these parties have got us beaten down. I mean, it's the parties that are running gerrymandering. You know, I mean, there are some Democratic states that gerrymandering is being done by Democrats in Massachusetts and in Maryland and in Illinois and in Hawaii, you know. So, I mean, there are not many, but there's some. But if you can get yourself past the party system and say, wait, and furthermore, if you look at America today, there are more independent voters, people who cannot legally vote in a party primary without declaring partisan preference. There are more of them than there are Republicans or Democrats. So why should we have party primaries? And furthermore, why should taxpayers pay for party primaries? Parties are private groups. They're private clubs. Most party primaries are paid for by taxpayers in the state. Why is that? That's crazy. I mean, I'm really trying to stir up a rebellion against the parties. I don't care whether or not you're a member of one party or another, but the parties have locked in advantage. The parties are a duopoly. You know, there's a reason why you can't run a third party in this country, and the rules are set up state after state after state to favor the two parties. And when they try to put a nonpartisan primary on the ballot in February, guess what? I mean, in Florida, guess what happened? The Republican and Democratic primaries hired the same lawyers, and they went to court to fight against the nonpartisan primary together because they understood it was a threat to them. They were in it together. So
We got a question from Kevin Bowie. Hedrick.
Hey, Hedrick, good to see you again.
yeah, Kevin.
You know, a lot of the stuff you've talked about, somebody from the far right or a populist right would embrace it. You know, too much money in politics, corporations not paying enough money. There seems to be a lot of common theme, but at the same time, we know that, we're so divided politically that we don't seem to be listening to each other. One side might be complaining about all the liberal dark money. Someone else is complaining about the conservative dark money. And it just seems from a tactical point of view that we haven't been able to unite that. And I just wonder what kind of thoughts you might have, because, a lot of the people I would think that would support me on the right in terms of ranked choice voting and a variety of other things that attack exactly what you're talking about, the two-party system, the duopoly, et cetera, they won't listen because they think, there's something funny about it, or they would feel uncomfortable agreeing with me with too much money in politics. And I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of messaging or tactics to get beyond that.
Do you know anything about Take Back Our Republic? Have you ever heard of that group?
Yeah, the gentleman down in Alabama,
John Pudner. Okay. John Pudner went to South Dakota in the year 2020, and he joined with a couple of women called, they call themselves the Badass Grandmas of North Dakota? Was it North Dakota, not South Dakota. Badass Grandmas of North Dakota. He, an extreme right political strategist, sided with them and helped them pass an anti-lobbying, anti-money referendum in that state, and he's done that before. That is one group that is willing to work with you on you. I mean, you have to slice off parts of the reform. They're not necessarily going to buy everything you want in the reform, but I mean, he's against foreign money coming in. Foreign money, that includes a lot of American corporations, because the question is, what's foreign? If an American corporation is 15% foreign owned, under FCC rules, if you try to buy a television station that's 15% foreign owned, it comes under different rules than if it's domestic. So there are thresholds here. You can get with him on that. He's livid about the subject of foreign money coming into American political campaigns. I don't think he's ready yet to buy ranked choice voting, but he's adopted a whole bunch of things that you would like. So there are people there. In Seattle, they got through public funding of campaigns with vouchers. Well, these are people, the conservatives are people who like school vouchers. And so the idea of a voucher plan appealed to them. If it was public money funding the campaign directly, it was one thing. If it was vouchers, they got a bunch of people from so-called patriot organizations, which tend to be right-wing, very conservative, political grassroots organizations. So there are people who are doing this. It's not easy to do. But if there's any way you can connect on any issue of political reform, particularly about outside money and that kind of stuff, with Take Back Our Republic, John Putner, try it. Get him to come up there. He'll come. He's been up there. I know. I've seen John Putner because I've been at events in New Hampshire where John Putner's been there. So I know he's been there, but that's several years ago. I always have this, have to check with Olivia to find out when was the last time I was there and when were these events. But I know he's up there. I would try him. And he's very effective. And he's quite right-wing in terms of the candidates he's pushing. But in terms of political reform, he's got a bunch of issues that are common with the ones you mentioned.
Ken, do you want to ask?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I was going to, I first raised my hand when you were talking about fairness as a great talking point, which I certainly agree with, although I have to say that every day of the week I get emails from one advocacy group or another where they talk about how unfair all of these voter suppression and campaign financing and frankly a whole lot of other issues are as well. And the word fairness doesn't seem to get them all that much headway. But I just wanted to...
One of the things we have to understand, excuse me, I want to answer your question.
Sure, yeah.
One of the problems is it depends upon getting people to get together across party and ideological lines, depends upon how the process starts and who's got their label on the reform. I mean, I think that Democrats and Congress have got a very good reform bill, but they're stupid in the way they push it because they put a Democratic label on it. And there's no chance even the members of the Republican Party who would like to go along with them are never going to buy it because it's got Democrat stamped all over it. So excuse me. So part of the problem that we have with all the emails that we're getting is they all come with very clear labels on them. And the sponsors are killing the content.
That's a very good point. Thank you for that. But what I wanted to ask you about now is on the ranked choice voting idea, which certainly intrigues the heck out of me as well. And I guess it seems to me, Rick, that ranked choice voting helps the centrists in each party to have a better chance of winning, but it really hurts anybody who is challenging the orthodox mainstream of a party, you know, like the liberal Democrats, or maybe even you care about the conservative Republicans. It seems like ranked choice voting, the middle of the road, perhaps quieter in rocking the boat representatives or candidates are going to have a better chance because they'll always be everybody's second choice. They won't be anathema to anybody. Whereas, you know, the more progressive challengers to the Democratic middle are never going to be the second choice or third choice of any Republican, let's say. And you can flip it to the other side as well.
Well, I think analytically you're right, but I think we also have to take a look at what our situation is. We're in one state after another, and certainly in the federal government, although I think Biden's record in 2022 was pretty impressive in terms of getting some bipartisan legislation. We're at a point where it's very hard to get anything to work. We're great at disagreeing. And so if we need a bit of a track record of actually getting things done to the point where we can then begin to disagree without being as disagreeable as we are now. So we may need to go through a period, you may be right, we may need to go through a period where if we can just find some way to form coalitions, that it may mean they're more centrist, it may mean that whatever reforms or changes we have will be more modest and it won't be as much as what you and I might like. But we've lost the experience of being successful at governing.
Yeah,
And
good point.
And that may be a necessary interim phase to get back so people start to have faith again that you can talk to people maybe a little ways on the other side. I mean, I go back to the maps of Congress where they used to map the votes, every vote of everybody on sort of charts. And when I first came to Washington back in the early 60s, it's a long time ago, the charts of Democrats and Republicans overlapped. There were conservative Democrats that were voting with Republicans, and there were liberal Republicans like Mac Mathias and Hugh Scott and Jake Javits and Saltonstall and others who were voting with the Democrats on. And now it's sort of they've separated, and there's this white space in between. We may need to rebuild the center a bit before we can actually get to where you want to go. I'm afraid that's the way it looks to me. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get the results I want to get right away, but I think it's important to get some results that are positive so that you start to have people having faith in the political process again.
Thanks, Hedrick, for that, because I
Thank
think
you.
people having faith in the political process is really important. George, did you unmute to ask a
I
question?
have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay. To the speaker, what role do the great propaganda machines like Fox News have in all this? And what could possibly be done about that, if anything?
Yeah, well, I hope you'll consider Fox News and a couple like it in a different category from the rest of the media. But well, I think we're going to need to watch and see what happens to Fox News in this libel case brought by Dominion Voting Systems. It looks to me as though they're at risk of taking a real shellacking. Not for being right wing, but for being so blatantly fraudulent, broadcasting opinions, information, supposed information, disinformation that they didn't believe in themselves. So in terms of Fox, it's a special category. What concerns me a little bit, not more, but in a different way, is my own part of the media, because we are such exploiters of conflict that we play up the polarization in this country. Now, there's no question there's a terrible political polarization in this country. But before the last election, I was talking to Kate about it before. She was talking to me about it. I went and did a talk in Orcas Island, and I did some analysis of the electorate before the election. And it struck me that in a number of swing states, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, you know them all, that the focus on the split of Democrats versus the 70% of the Republicans that buy the big lie of Donald Trump that the 2020 election was stolen, ignores the 30% of Republicans, the Liz Cheney Republicans, and maybe the Liz Cheney independents who lean Republican. And we're so focused on our differences that we don't see the people who are marginally different from us, who disagree with us on some things, but don't necessarily find us hateful, don't necessarily find us the enemy. And it seems to me, and links up with my last answer, that we need to not be so quick to categorize each other. And I think we in the media are contributing terribly to that. I think we're too quick to jump to analysis based on the simplistic notion that states are red or states are blue. I don't know what the vote was in Texas, and I don't know what you think about Texas, but politically it disturbs me terribly. And yet there are probably 8 or 10 million people in Texas with whom you and I would probably agree on most issues, and we tend to forget them because we have Greg Abbott and senators from Texas in our minds. We are contributing, sadly, I think, to the division in this country by not spending enough time ferreting out those areas where there are overlapping opinions or where the opinions are really complicated. I think on the issue of abortion today, if you do a panoply, there are a whole lot of people that have mixed notions about abortion. And we have a picture now that it's either you're against it or you're for it. And I think there's a much more variegated set of opinions in this country. And if we were exploring them more, we might get ourselves out of some of the problems we're in. There's some hard nuts, and they're going to be difficult to crack, and something's going to have to happen there. I'm not suggesting everything will melt away, but I do think that the emphasis on polarization in the media, which is a constant drumbeat, is not helpful to the body politic.
So Hedrick, Dan McMillan will be the next question. And then Ursula, I want to end with Ursula's question of what gives you hope. So save a minute for that. But Dan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I want to make a case that, because there are so many different problems with our system and so many proposals for reform, but I'd like to make a case for privileging the campaign finance problem far above other problems and arguing that that's the linchpin and that is where we get the most bang for the buck. And part of my argument is that, although I think everyone who observes politics understands that money is a problem, I think almost everyone fails to see the great bulk of the damage that the money has done to our political system since the end of the 1970s, because the bulk of the damage is invisible, because it's an absent rather than the presence. The biggest problem with the money is not the transparent influence peddling that we see, like fossil fuel companies purchase climate change denial, or we can't regulate drug prices because of donations from pharma. The bigger part of the problem is all the questions we should be asking, all the good policy ideas, all the potential leaders who never enter the political conversation because they will not attract the money to get a campaign off the ground. And as the arms race proceeded between the parties in fundraising and spending, beginning at the end of the 1970s, and as these campaigns got more and more expensive, this sort of no-go space of policies and ideas and personnel got bigger and bigger. Another thing that I think is worth highlighting with regard in support of my argument that we focus on the money problem is just that the way that the cost of elections at the federal level has skyrocketed just in the last 6 years. I think, Hedrick, you actually already mentioned this, doubling in constant dollars from 2016 to 2020. You mentioned what I think is by far the most promising approach, which is this democracy voucher system that they pioneered in Seattle. There are a whole bunch of other groups that are pushing for that at the state and local level across the country. There's also an effort in New Hampshire. My organization, Save Democracy in America, our ultimate goal is a democracy voucher system for the financing of federal elections for that reason. So that was really more of a mini speech than a question, but if you have any comments on what I've said, I'm all ears.
Well, of course, we had public funding of presidential campaigns up through Bill Clinton, 1996. So we had 2 or 3 decades there where there were limits on spending. There was public funding, and both parties, both major parties abided by it. So public funding is something that,
I'm sorry, that is just. Hedrick, that
You
is
might
only
just tell me
one
I'm
race
wrong?
for the presidency. I mean,
pardon me?
but that was only public funding for the general election component for one office, the presidency.
It wasn't just the general.
There was
it
no
was al-
public
I'm sorry, it
funding.
was also in the primaries. It was also in the primaries. It was not just for the general election. Listen, we gave up on that system. The candidates opted out of it. And we, the people, didn't continue to fund it. So, but all I'm saying is, you want to go in that direction, there's at least historical precedent for you doing that. Public funding is a good way to reduce the influence of money. It won't get money out of politics, but it's a good way to reduce it. I frankly don't think you're ever going to get money out of politics. I really don't. There's no way you're going to have people run for office where it's not going to cost something. So you got to find out who pays for it. Whoever pays for it, it works for them. And the public funding, I can tell you, in Connecticut has had a tremendous impact on that legislature and on the work that it does. In terms of whether or not you only go after money in politics, a lot of it depends upon what the political terrain is in the state you're working in. Because some of these other states have done better going with ranked choice voting, going with nonpartisan primaries, going with gerrymander reform. And I think it would be crazy to persuade them not to do it. Michigan got very good gerrymander reform. It hasn't been able to do anything very significantly about money in politics. So I happen to have felt the way you did about 5 or 6 years ago. I happen to think now getting the parties under control is a more hopeful and a more important problem. But I'm not going to argue with you about whether or not we ought to do this reform or that reform. They're all needed.
Hedrick, what gives you hope to close us out?
Well, I take a lot of hope from the 2022 election. There was a very serious danger that there were 12 right-wing candidates for Secretary of State around the country who, if they had been elected in all those states, would have been counting the votes or deciding what the votes were in 2024. And all but 3 of them were beaten, and 2 of them were in red states where it was a walkaway anyway, so you're not going to stop them. So I think that was very important. You beat the gubernatorial candidates proposed by Donald Trump in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I think that gives me a lot of encouragement. What it says to me is that there are people who, regardless of their party identity, recognize a genuine threat to American democracy, to the whole system. And when push comes to shove, they're going to vote that way. Now, the margins weren't very large. It's going to be very close again in 2024, but that encourages me. Second thing that encourages me is that Donald Trump is being investigated, and I believe Donald Trump will be indicted on the issue of the 2020 election and his conduct in the 2020 election, which is a very important statement of law, a statement of affirming our system of law that needs to be made. So that I think that's coming. I'm encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by some of the bipartisan legislation that was passed in this last Congress. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, the act that was passed to help competition with China, the modernization of the 1887 Electoral Vote Count Act was very important in trying to prevent a repeat of that whole episode with Mike Pence and the effort to try to throw out some of the electors from the states. So I think there have been a number. I'm in a more positive frame of mind. I'm not really positive, but I'm in a more positive frame of mind now than I was before the 2022 election. I think those are promising developments. You know, organizations like you encourage me, like yours encourage me. And I'm not in touch with them all over the country, but I'm aware of some of them. Some of the work being done by Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, and people working on nonpartisan primaries. I mean, people are hanging in there. And we've had a real assault. This is probably the most severe assault on our democracy in my lifetime. And I'm getting close to 90. So that's a long time. it's been resisted. It's been blocked. It's been stopped. It's still there. It's still a threat. We still have to be on guard. We still have to be engaged. But we've worked at it hard. Lots of good people put in lots of time, lots of effort, lots of get out the vote effort, lots of registration effort, lots of engagement. I mean, I'm encouraged. People are, I think, more aware today that democracy is not a once every 4 years game. It's not a spectator sport. It's an engagement sport. It's an action sport, and you got to be on it all the time. So it's not easy. I'm not a Cassandra here, and I'm not a Pollyanna. It's hard work, but I'm encouraged because people have done it. People have stood up. Michael Cohen decided at some point to live with himself, with his wife and his children. He had a level on the hush payment. That's now the center of the case in New York. I don't know how that case in New York is going to come out, but something happened there that caused him to do that. Rusty Powers, the Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, decided he had to come forward and testify before the January 6th committee. You've got, Jesus, this guy Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, who took that damn telephone call from Donald Trump on January 2nd and kept saying to him, Mr. President, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. I can't find it. I can't count on it. There's no evidence. And the same thing happened in Maricopa County in Arizona, and the same thing happened in Wayne County, Michigan. There are people who put themselves on the line for our democracy, and they're not all D&I labels. There are some R labels. I don't happen to agree with Mike Pence, but Mike Pence did the right thing on a critical moment in our lives, and there were people outside shouting, "Hang Mike Pence." So I think part of what we have to do is to recognize that some of the people who are not our allies have done things that are important for the system that we cherish. That encourages me.
Thank you so much, Hedrick, for all of your wisdom tonight. We're going to break into breakout rooms, but if everyone wants to give Hedrick a round of applause, we'll go into the breakout rooms to do book discussions, as well as the question for your shorter breakout rooms tonight is what gives you hope. So going to create the breakout groups. Thank you so much, Hedrick, for being with us tonight.
Great to talk to you. Let me know what you guys decide to do.